there's an article of faith shared by clergy of all denominations that goes like this. When you go to a new call, don't ever try to change anything about the worship service for at least your first year. So you can imagine how I felt soon after I arrived at the first parish in Norwell as the first woman minister there. And the board chair called me one night and he said, so there's a bit of a conflict in the church that we did not tell you about during your candidating week, and I was like, my heart, oh my gosh, because they had a conflict that I knew about the use of some of their land that had resulted in a lot of acting out and some serious feelings hurt and so on. So my heart was pounding, and Rick said, so the deal is that we have tension and conflict around our church covenant. Like, no big deal, just the unison affirmation that is at the center of the worship service and really kind of like the guiding marching orders for the congregation. And I said to Rick, okay, so how fast are you trying to get me fired from this position? And I really meant it. I was terrified. I thought, I don't want to deal with that. Are you kidding? I don't want to touch it. This church was gathered in 1642. And I'm the first woman minister coming in following somebody who'd been in the tenure for 32 years. Like, this is already potentially what we call an unintentional interim position. So Rick laughed and he said, let's talk. So we had a very long talk. And then I said, well, why don't we talk about it with the board? And they were wonderful. And they said, look, however you decide you want to handle this, we fully support whatever you feel that we need to do to deal with this conflict. I was like, well, thanks. So they were like all lining up behind me and I was out in front. So the first thing I had to figure out is like, what? I know this is a very important statement, but what is a covenant, really? I mean, of course, I'd been in church life for a long time. I was raised Unitarian Universalist. This is a word that had come in and out of my consciousness, but I had not really thought about it much. It seemed like a churchy way to say mission statement, right? And I knew that we had, as Unitarian Universalists, the 7 principles, which are the covenant that the congregations have with one another. So pretty obvious, like the promises and the kind of, again, guiding principles. And I'd learned in seminary that the colonial Puritan Church of New England, which ended up splitting, and some of it which became the Unitarian movement, had a covenant among themselves about governance, and they called it the Cambridge Platform, and it informed all of their practices. So that's 17th century. Why is this term still kicking around? I wondered, is this just like a historical remnant that we don't even need anymore? So what happened next is that I dove into researching where congregational covenants came from, where the idea came from, why they were still foundational to Unitarian Universalism. And I became a covenant nerd. I collected a full library of books, many of them out of print, hard to find. And I eventually designed a covenanting process that worked beautifully in Norwell and that I went on to teach through General Assembly seminars to hundreds of Unitarian Universalist lay leaders and clergy, also doing some consultations with congregations. And then I went and got a doctoral degree focused on covenant and wrote my dissertation on congregational covenanting, their origins and why they still matter. So this is something that I fell deeply, deeply in love with, that is so important to me. I'm still trying to articulate why. So I appreciate having this opportunity with you to keep exploring that. The process of covenanting in Norwell turned out to be a wholehearted effort that involved the entire congregation meeting multiple times in the evenings and entrusting a wordsmithing team to draft up a version of the best distillation of what the congregation had shared as the deepest promises that they wanted to make to each other and to the highest. And that was an act of trust too, because as you probably know, we are people who love to edit each other's work. And we love to sit in committee and go like, well, that comma should really be a semicolon, and that kind of thing. And I said to the board, like, this either goes up or it goes down. We are not going to wordsmith this from the floor of a congregational meeting, because we'll be there for 7 years. And they said, we got it. And so the covenant ended up being this at the end of the process. When the wordsmithing team finally presented this draft, we said it has to be unanimous or thumbs down, and we'll go back to the drawing board. And this is what we presented. In the bonds of fellowship and love, we unite to cultivate reverence, to promote spiritual growth and ethical commitment, to minister to each other's needs and to those of humanity, to celebrate the sacred moments of life's passage, and to honor the holiness at the heart of being. And there was a silence, and then there was a vote, and everybody said, yeah, that sounds like it belongs to us. And I actually almost started to cry reading those words, which informs me that I still have a real emotional charge with that process that remains in my body from all that work that we did. So it's a lovely statement. But what makes that affirmation a covenant rather than just a missioned statement? Well, what I eventually learned, and I'm still learning, is that the difference is metaphysical. It's spiritual. A mission statement is a job description that leaders of an organization or voluntary group set themselves as their own, guiding goals, what they want to achieve. But a covenant proceeds from the foundational assumption that the inescapable, this is James Luther Adams' expression, the inescapable commanding reality that sustains and transforms all meaningful existence, which some call God, others call the universe, or energy, or nature, that energy, that force, moves within and among human beings and connects them to each other and to itself. So a covenant is a statement crafted by a congregation that responds to God's love, that's my language, or the spirit of love, through which we experience life as meaningful, that force that calls us out of our separateness to be made a people. It's a statement, therefore, not just of goals, but of consent and affirmation, that we are willing to be made a people. Now, if that sounds scary to you, I want you to just abide with that anxiety or that discomfort. It's okay to feel that. Like, I don't know. Am I okay with being made a people? It sounds like something that happens to, Play-Doh, like we all get mushed together. What might happen to any of us? What might happen to any of us if we consent to cherish community as much as we cherish and honor our individuality? It's big stuff. That's where covenant leads us and assumes and presumes that that's good for our souls. In fact, in the original 1642 covenant in what became the first parish in Norwell, it speaks of them covenanting for the good of their souls and those whose hearts God shall incline to join with us. Did you get that? Isn't that gorgeous? Those whose hearts God shall incline to join with us. So inviting. It's not about them. It's not a social club. It's the love that's working in the world that's going to gather people to join with them. So I think back to my own years of church shopping And now I understand that it was not my will alone that was getting me across the thresholds of those churches. On the many Sundays, I did that alone while my boyfriend slept in and spent his day with coffee and the Sunday paper, wondering, what is she doing? Why is she doing this? A covenanted people is the exact opposite of a consumeristic people. And that's why it's way more radical in our cultural context than you may have realized. The concept of covenants is ancient. It's thousands of years old. The Puritan ministers who developed the idea of organizing congregations around covenant, and this happened back in England in the 17th century, they were looking for a grounding for their congregational organization, and they went way back to the original the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, for inspiration, and they went all the way back to Moses' encounter with the burning bush, where the one God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam emerges for the first time in human history as a unity, and emerges as one that wants to be in committed relationship with human beings. And this is a first. This God says, look, I don't need you to just do these rituals to appease me or make these offerings to me. I actually want to be in a moral, evolutionary relationship with you. And by the way, here's a bunch of commandments. So let's get started with those. And it all begins there. And so here we are. Over time, we human beings have become much more sophisticated, and I think you might agree with me, much more alienated from each other. We have become much more alienated from each other, from ourselves, I think, and from the source of life. We have so many comforts, so many advances that make life more bearable and certainly longer. But there is more evidence than anybody needs to suggest that we are suffering spiritually. Our connectedness to a reality that sustains and transforms is tenuous and non-existent for too many people. There is rampant numbness, spiritual death, and some so lost that they don't even struggle for something deeper. They are splashing in the shallows their entire lives, consuming themselves with petty concerns and pursuits. Something happened to me when I was church shopping and seeking in the early 1990s. I lived in Minnesota, and I went to Rainbow Foods one afternoon to do our grocery shopping. And Rainbow Foods is like this enormous beast of a grocery store. You go in and you're doing a lot of walking. You're getting a lot of steps in going through Rainbow Foods. And I went into the produce section. And I was really wheeling my cart and just kind of like, not thinking about anything. And I saw this group of people, Russian. I was listening and I was like, I think they're speaking Russian. And they were gathered around the produce and they were touching apples and oranges and bananas and pears and whatever was there. They were like marveling at it. And they were holding some of it and they were weeping. Some of them were weeping, they were sobbing. It was really bizarre. It was really intense. I didn't really know what was going on, but I didn't want to interfere with them. It was just one of those things. Sometimes you come upon people in a state of high emotion and you're like, okay, I think I will give them their space. So I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to be, noticeable, so I just kind of froze where I was, and I was starting to sort of back away. And this one man who spoke English, and I realized they were maybe a tour group or a visiting group of some kind, he turned to me and he said, no, please don't be afraid. Please don't worry. Please excuse us. And he wiped tears from his eyes. He said, we come from a place where we stand on long lines to get into empty stores. We stand on long lines to get into empty stores. And so this is just amazing to us. And he gestured at, all of the fruits and vegetables that I was just going to walk by or just pick up without thinking. And something hit me on that day that I'm still working through, but I thought about all the glossy, excellent variety of products and experiences that I expected, I just assumed would be and should be available to me at all times as an American consumer. And I was really humbled, and I was changed. It was a conversion experience. I realized deeply within myself that I had been really locked away in my place of critical assessment and evaluating, and that what touched me most deeply, what would touch my soul more deeply than that, was the spirit of gratitude and appreciation for blessing that this Russian group had exemplified upon beholding a pile of apples and bananas and pears. I started on that very day to turn from orienting myself around entitlement and expectation that I would have endless, wonderful choices before me, to one of opening myself and readying myself for those things to which life might be calling me. What a surprise. What possibility. Could it be that you too are chosen, are wanted, called forth to live deeply in the bonds of fellowship, service, and love that we call the covenanted community? That chosenness could be at the bottom of all of this. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth, its sacrament, and service, its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. Inscribe these words upon your heart.